Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. Some years ago, a friend who went on to become kind of a policy wonk told me that social issues like abortion just don't matter. They're a spectacle, he said, and the needle will never move in either direction. Roe v. Wade will never be overturned, and both parties will continue using the issue as a rallying cry, never intending for anything to really change in the status quo. And so he said, a Christian who really wants to make a difference in politics should focus on things like foreign policy and economics and other areas where real change is possible. Well, there's a very good chance that by the time you hear this podcast, my friend will have been proved decisively wrong. The Supreme Court may have vacated its half-century-old decision in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. Those of us who have fought and prayed and worked to end the legal killing of unborn children would receive that news with solemn celebration and, I think, thanks to God. But it's important to understand that abortion is much more than just a bad Supreme Court decision all those years ago, or even a series of decisions. Abortion is actually a kind of poison that has worked its way through American society and institutions. It has changed everything it comes into contact with, and never for the better. As we look forward to the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, or let it sink in, and as we look to the next stage of the fight for life, it's important to take stock of the damage that poison has done to our society and to commit ourselves to knitting together again a country that abortion has torn apart. Well, to do that today, I welcome two very special guests to talk about a very special new book. Ryan Anderson and Alexandra DeSanctis are the authors of Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. Ryan Anderson is a political philosopher and president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, including When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender movement, and Truth Overruled: The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. Alexandra DeSanctis is a staff writer at National Review and a visiting fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She graduated from Notre Dame and is a leading U.S. journalist covering politics, culture, and religion. Ryan and Alexandra, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I want to ask as we start off here, what prompted this book and what's new about it? Because, we've got a lot of books about abortion. We've got a lot of books sort of outlining the apologetic arguments against abortion. What is unique about this and what made you guys feel called to write it?
Yeah, I think we're at a moment, certainly you laid out kind of where we are in terms of the possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned. So I think we are at a unique time where if, as we hope and pray that is what happens, we're suddenly going to be having, instead of this national abortion debate, or in addition to our national federal level abortion debate, we're going to be having 50 debates across the entire country about what our state laws are going to look like when it comes to abortion, what kind of, policies there are going to be to support families, to protect unborn children. That's going to be happening at the micro level across the country. And so we wanted to contribute to that by kind of writing a pro-life roadmap. How do pro-lifers think and talk about this issue moving forward? And we wrote it in a way hoping it's accessible to people who don't agree with us. We tried to be, as fair as possible. We tried to be well-researched, fact-based, so people can understand where we're coming from, even if they disagree. But it really is a pro-life roadmap. And I think what's unique about the argument is we kind of go beyond the fundamental harm of abortion, which is it kills an innocent human being, right? That's always wrong. It's unjust. It's immoral. But abortion has harmed so much more than that. And I think it's important for pro-lifers to learn how to make that case too.
The title is Tearing Us Apart, and the implication is that, abortion is tearing us apart. The subtitle is How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. It's really an allusion to that point, that there's much more going on here than just the death of a child. Could you give me kind of a broad overview of why abortion has a corrupting influence in all these areas you name? Why this issue? Why is it of special significance?
I think the underlying reason is that it's built on a lie about what it is to be a human. So, to borrow the title of, a great book by one of our colleagues at EPBC, Carter Sneed, someone who we cite extensively in our own book, but he wrote a book a little over a year ago titled What It Is to Be a Human, and abortion gets that wrong. And if you get human nature wrong, you get anthropology wrong, and then you try to build various systems on a lie about the human person, it's going to have negative consequences. And so, Tearing Us Apart, the title, it has a double meaning. Abortion literally tears apart the unborn baby, but it's also torn us apart as a body politic, as a political community, as a civil society. And so what we do methodologically, chapter by chapter by chapter, is look at first how it's harmed the unborn child by killing the unborn child. Second, how it has harmed women and families and the relationships between men and women. Third, how it has harmed people who are already marginalized with sex-selective abortion, with elevated rates of abortion for racial minorities, with disability-based abortion. We refer to these as lethal discrimination in the womb. Fourth, how it's harmed the medical profession, both the lies that medical doctors have told, but also how it's corrupted the practice of medicine. Fifth, how it's undermined constitutional kind of rule of law, self-government by trying to prop up a lie about what the Constitution says when the Constitution doesn't say what Roe or Casey say it says. Six, how it's harmed democratic self-government, how it's corrupted the political process, particularly with, pro-life Democrats used to be a reality. Now they're an endangered species. How it's corrupted the political witness of countless believers, both Catholic and Protestant, personally opposed, but pro-choice. Look at Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, et cetera. And then seventh chapter, we look at the culture, how it's corrupted popular culture, how it's corrupted business culture, how it's corrupted social media, how it's corrupted news culture. Just a variety of ways. And the conclusion then is the subtitle. It harms everything. It solves nothing. It's been a disaster. And now is the time to finally admit it. So hopefully the Supreme Court will be overturning Roe. By the time this is airing, we will know the decision. We wrote the book not knowing what the outcome of the Dobbs case is. By the time the book is released, we will know the outcome of the Dobbs case. Hopefully the court admits they got it wrong, but now it's also necessary for us as citizens of a self-governing republic to admit we've gotten it wrong in the past, and now it's time to finally get it right.
I love that you go through all of these areas because it illustrates a fundamental truth that you guys explicitly say in the introduction. You got this great line. It says that one of the most fundamental truths about what it means to be human is that we belong to each other. And abortion is premised on an utter repudiation of this reality. This is one thing, like I said, I loved about the book. You view abortion as kind of flowing from these upstream bad ideas about how society works and what human relations should look like. If you had to sort of encapsulate those bad ideas that 50 years ago almost resulted in abortion being declared by the court protected nationwide, what would you say those ideas are?
I would point to another of our colleagues, Erica Bacchiacchi, who's done a lot of writing and work about kind of the ways that abortion harms women and how, the earliest feminists were actually pro-life because they believed that abortion not only was immoral and wrong because it killed an unborn child, but because it actually harmed women too. And it didn't make women better off. It didn't make them more free or more equal to men. And I think there's kind of a lie at the root of abortion that goes along with that notion, right? That this is bad for women. And that is that women and mothers and fathers owe something to their children, right? And abortion kind of disregards that or rejects that idea, the idea that we have duties to care for one another and that mothers and fathers have a responsibility both to one another and to their children. So I think that would be the main one I would point to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then just add, you can look at what Michael Sandel, the political philosopher at Harvard, has called the rise of the unencumbered self and liberalism as, the embodiment of the unencumbered self. What our colleague Carl Trueman has written beautifully on the rise of expressive individualism. Robert Bellah was the scholar who first coined that phrase, but then Trueman's, his big book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then his shorter book, Strange New World, really highlight how expressive individualism coupled with body self dualism, and then, false understandings of autonomy, the unencumbered self, they really gave rise. And, many of these ideologies have roots going back hundreds of years. I think if you go all the way back, you could trace it back to nominalism and voluntarism at the end of the medieval period, beginning of the modern period. I think more approximately, a lot of these ideas take place mid-20th century. They're what fueled the sexual revolution. It's a bad vision of an autonomous adult should do with his or her body whatever an autonomous adult wants to, and there shouldn't be any consequences. There are no non-chosen obligations, meaning that there aren't any duties that are just natural, right? Americans talk a lot about natural rights. We don't talk as much about natural duties. There aren't any unchosen obligations, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, all of those various philosophical strands, as they just got put into the air that we breathe, the culture that we swim in. I don't think people ever read Robert Bellah or Michael Sandel, but that's what the popular culture has habituated people to. And cultures cultivate. And I think many people were cultivated in an understanding that the body is just a costume or a vehicle. The real self is the inner me. And I'm supposed to give expression to my individuality using my body as a vehicle for that expressive individualism. And you put this together and it explains not just what's going on in the abortion context, but what's going on in the transgender context, what's going on with the redefinition of marriage. There are a variety of things happening simultaneously that I think are all fruit from the same bad ideological tree.
This is something that you can kind of get a hint of when you listen to pro-choice or pro-abortion rhetoric too, that this isn't just about, whether a woman wants a baby or doesn't want a baby at any given juncture in her life. Abortion has always been about much more. It's always been a prop that exists in order to be a sort of backstop, is what you call it, to a way of seeing ourselves, a way of living, a way of treating life, a way of understanding family and sexuality and so forth. And this is the guarantee, borrowing on a number of other writers call it a sort of sacrament that props up this whole thing. And I think it's what's, part of so valuable about this book is the friend I mentioned at the beginning of this, I think was looking at abortion as a very discrete issue. It's this one thing, moral, morality and social policy voters are concerned about, but it's really not something that guys like him who are more concerned about foreign policy should care about. But this book is a very startling reminder and argument that abortion actually has corrupted our whole philosophy and conscience as a nation, and that undoing this means undoing damage that we didn't even think we had done to ourselves. But I mean, there's so much to dive into in the book, and I appreciate you giving sort of a summary of the areas you deal with initially.
I think you're accurately describing what Alexandra and I set out to do with the book in terms of, having a holistic taking stock of where we are 49 and a half years after Roe. And therefore, what we hope is useful to readers is that, readers are going to know when they're having conversations with friends, family, colleagues, etc., which vector is the right way of approaching it with their given, interlocutor, with their given audience. Maybe it's, coming in by talking about how abortion has harmed women. Maybe it's how it's harmed minorities. Maybe it's how it's corrupted medicine. It's giving people lots of different ways of approaching the conversation where they can know, given what I know my loved one cares most about, this is the best way of broaching the subject. So it's really meant to be equipping people, empowering people, where you can see the big picture and then figure out, how do I help someone else see the big picture? Where do I start? How do I strategically approach it?
To tie into what you were mentioning about your friend, one of the sort of early thoughts I had that sort of led to our thesis and into the book was just how often I come across people who either write or say, I probably wouldn't have an abortion, but I don't want to, it has nothing to do with me, essentially, right? I would let somebody else do it because we shouldn't make those decisions for them. And it's not my problem, right? This has nothing to do with me. And I thought about that a lot because I hear it all the time. I think it's just around us all the time in the abortion debate, this idea that it has nothing to do with us unless we're the one choosing or performing the abortion. That's simply not true, right? If we have a legalized regime of intentionally killing innocent human beings, that has to have something to do with all of us. That has to harm all of us. And so, while we do lay out kind of the specifics, all of these many aspects of our culture and society that have been harmed, I think there's kind of a big picture theoretical way in which we are all worse off for living in a society that sanctions that makes that legal, that thinks that's, at least some number of people think that's morally acceptable. So I hope it's the kind of book that helps people realize this is actually not kind of a sit on the sidelines issue. This matters for all of us.
Well, that actually gets really well to, one of the notes I took reading it, and that is that there's a kind of resensitizing to the whole issue that you guys implicitly do over the course of the book, especially when it comes to like medical facts and the language used to describe it. So you don't do a lot of, straight up polemics as much as just quoting pro-abortion activists and judges and politicians and, corporate figures who use the most stilted Orwellian sort of cold clinical language to describe these things. And, I write for a living, so I've come to realize that one of the things people do when they know they're BSing you and they know they're telling a lie is they resort to these cold, clinical, technical words, and they don't tell you the truth. And I found myself becoming more sensitized to the whole issue, to remembering why I'm pro-life, to remembering that this is actually a horrifying atrocity that has been like enshrined at the core of our legal system in our country. Talk to us about some of the other ways that you think people have become desensitized to the whole abortion issue. So besides just the language, what else has happened that has led us to sort of, even as pro-lifers, to look at this and go, this is just an accepted reality. This is just part of our background. It's always going to exist.
Yeah. So, I mean, other ways in which we've been desensitized, I think part of it is just that so many people became despondent. So your friend just thought that, like, we're never going to make progress. To a certain extent, he wasn't utterly irrational. Alexandra and I both work in DC, and there are a lot of politicians who campaign on being pro-life. They get to DC, and not only do they do nothing, but they intentionally try to prevent, actual pro-life politicians from getting stuff done. I mean, the number of elected Republicans who would campaign on being pro-life and then, like, the euphemistic smoke-filled rooms where the work actually gets done would be like, yeah, we're not ever going to bring that bill to the floor. It's divisive. It's controversial. Let's just focus on, taxes and trade or whatever. I mean, so there was a reason people could just say, all right, we voted this way for 40 some years and look at the judges. There were a lot of bad picks early on. Casey was decided by a court that was, I think, 7 of the 9 had been appointed by Republicans. We cite the actual figure in the book, and I'm just now getting old and gray and can't remember it, but it was ridiculous. I mean, everyone thought that we now can count to 5, it's going to be overturned, and then they didn't, right? And so it's understandable why people would say it's all just lip service, it's never going to happen. And so that also gives us an opportunity. If Roe and Casey are finally overturned, now elected officials are really going to have to put their money where their mouth is. They can't just say, I'm pro-life and therefore I'm against Roe, and I'll vote to confirm justices that will overturn Roe. When Roe's gone, now it's going to be, all right, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to vote for a 20-week bill, a 15-week bill, a heartbeat bill, a conception bill? Are you going to vote to allocate money to support, for example, Texas? Everyone knows about the heartbeat bill, which prohibited abortion after a heartbeat can be detected, which is around 6 weeks. They also allocated $100 million to the Texas Alternatives to Abortion program. And of course, the media didn't cover that aspect at all. But it's really going to be a put up or shut up moment for politicians who run as being pro-life. To me, that's a cause of hope, right? Because, rather than losing hope, growing a little despondent because, it's been 50 years and nothing ever changes, one, it vindicates the people who did the hard work without losing hope for the past 50 years. Alexandra and I were both born after the Roe decision. It was, relatively speaking, easy for us to be pro-life because of people who in the 70s and the 80s, when it was really hard to be pro-life, did that work. We deserve to give them a lot of praise and just, gratitude. We should be hopeful that now real meaningful work can get done. And the people who do real work, we can hold them accountable and we can replace them. We can separate the goats and the sheep in a way that it was harder for your average voter because they didn't know what was happening behind closed doors in DC, et cetera, et cetera.
That's great. Yep. Part of the process that's going to take place now as part of that reckoning is going to be a revival of the core arguments, because no longer is it a certainty that the Supreme Court will simply swat down pro-life legislation. Like you said, now politicians will be held to account to actually do something on the state level and, even potentially the federal level. And so we get a lot of these arguments coming back to the fore that I think are upstream of abortion itself as an accepted reality. So you go through some of these in the first chapter, which I think was, one of the most valuable moments in the whole book. And obviously we can't get to everything, but I think it would be valuable to reflect for a moment on some of those and why they are so deeply mistaken. So I'll just rattle off a few of them and you guys can kind of pick the ones that you want to talk about, because we will be thinking about these. We will be arguing about these, right? So you deal with body self dualism, moral dualism, bodily autonomy, the idea that women will be forced to give birth if abortion is illegal, and then the whole idea of back alley abortions, which was a really big motivating factor, as you chronicle, in the legalization of abortion, ultimately to the Roe v. Wade decision. So how do you respond or begin to respond to some of those very sophisticated and older arguments?
Well, I'll start with the easy ones and let Ryan handle the harder ones that he knows a lot more about. But I think the back alley abortions comment is one of the most common arguments we hear from abortion supporters. Planned Parenthood officials say this all the time, that thousands of women were dying in illegal, unsafe abortions before Roe. They say this, even to this day, even though the Washington Post has awarded them 4 Pinocchios for doing so, right? That's how false this is. It's simply not true. It doesn't track in the numbers. Readers will see the footnotes in our book if they want to go and track down the numbers for themselves. Somewhere closer to 150, somewhere between 150, 300 women died as a result of illegal, unsafe abortions before Roe. And of course, that's far too many, but it was not the case that 5,000, 10,000 women were dying before Roe, as pro-abortion advocates said at the time. And after the fact, kind of pro-life converts like Dr. Bernard Nathanson, for example, who were pro-abortion at the time of Roe, who an abortionist himself, who kind of lobbied the court on behalf of the pro-abortion activists at the time of Roe, helped invent these numbers and later on said these were just not true. We knew what we wanted the court to do. We knew what we had to say to get that to come about. One of the things we wanted to say was that women would be better off if abortion were legal, that women would be safe, they would stop dying. And so they just invented these numbers out of whole cloth. So it's simply not true. And yet we hear this still decades later, even though the numbers tell a different story.
And well, one of the things that I love that you guys point this out in the book is that those numbers are fishy because the number of women we were told were dying from unsafe back alley abortions actually exceeded the number of deaths among women from all causes. So it's like, wow, this must be very deadly.
They're just counting on us not to do our research. Right.
And it's amazing, too, the way you describe the pro-choice mindset. What makes people tick? I mean, what is the goodwill motivation or maybe the not goodwill motivation? What is the nefarious motivation behind some of this stuff? The individual that you just mentioned said something to the effect of, we thought this was a good cause. We thought, hey, we're fighting for something that's good and right. We don't need to get too specific about the numbers. It's a useful number, right? And so pro-choicers were even rationalizing the dishonesty to themselves, which is, on one level shocking, but on another level, it's like, well, you've already decided that a baby is okay to kill. I guess it's not such a leap to think it's okay to fudge the numbers in service of that. Talk to me about this idea of the two dualisms, the body-self dualism and the moral dualism, because I think when I've encountered pro-choice arguments in the past, this has been where people go to, are these bifurcations. So help me understand that.
Yeah, sure. So for listeners to kind of, see where we are in the argument, some people want to say, the unborn baby, it's not really a baby, it's a clump of cells. We don't know when human life begins. But no one with like a shred of intelligence or education makes those sorts of arguments, because it's just like anyone with like a basic high school level of biological knowledge knows that a new organism comes into existence when fertilization is complete, across the mammalian species. And so that means a new human organism comes into existence when human fertilization is complete. So that when a human sperm fertilizes a human egg, that human zygote, that human embryo, that human fetus is a new, complete, though immature human being. And even the most thoughtful and intellectually rigorous pro-choice advocates acknowledge that, because they know it's an utterly hopeless proposition to try to deny that, right? It's just, so, first, we take readers through that just to point out that, look, we got biology on our side. But then we point to the more sophisticated argument, which also I think is somewhat sophistical, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where you get the body self dualism and the moral dualism. And so it's two different forms where someone will say, oh, yeah, fine. It's a human being, but it's not a human person. And to be a person, you need some added qualification. And the underlying thesis here is what, I'm a graduate of Princeton. One of our, professors of bioethics, professor of human values, was Peter Singer. Peter Singer is famous for saying that it's speciesism, so akin to racism or sexism, to value one species higher than the other. And so if you value human beings more highly than non-humans, you're a speciesist, just like a racist or a sexist. So he says, no, what we should do is we should value persons higher, but they could be non-human persons. There's nothing just about being a human that matters, so it needs to be personhood. All right, so then the personhood arguments come in two different forms: the moral dualism, the body self dualism. All right, so the body self dualism is that the real me is something other than a body. The real me is the center of consciousness, awareness, higher mental capacities, and I just somehow inhabit a body. I'm associated with the body. It's unclear how we interact, how the self and the body interact. And that's the argument they'll make. It has all sorts of problems, right? I mean, one is the interaction problem. How does the real self and then the bodily self interact? Another just philosophical problem with this is, why should I believe your theory rather than my own embodied experience of my own self as an embodied being? That, like, the burden of proof here is on the philosopher who's going to sell me a theory in which I'm not an embodied being. I'm something other than an embodied being. And then there's also a problem of, well, how do you explain right now we're looking at each other with our eyes and our optical nerves. We're listening to each other with our ears and our eardrums. But then we're also thinking, right? It's not just that I see blobs on the screen, but I see you, a person. It's not just that I hear frequencies, but I hear words that form sentences that make arguments. And that's a rational mental activity, right? And so is it two different subjects, right? A physical subject that's hearing pitches and, seeing visual, light spectra, and then the immaterial subject that is, compiling the arguments and evaluating. It makes much more sense to say it's a single solitary subject who's engaged in both physical and spiritual action. So anyway, so body self dualism fails for a variety of reasons. And so as a result, the body self dualist will say, I was never an unborn baby. There was a physical organism that was in my mother's womb, but I am not that physical organism. I came into existence 2 years later. And so it's also worth pointing out that this justifies not just abortion, but infanticide. That, and that's why there's a famous essay by the Colorado University professor Michael Tooley titled Abortion and Infanticide. He bit the bullet. He's like, the arguments that justify abortion also justified infanticide. All right, so then the moral dualism says, no, of course I'm a bodily being. I'm not going to be ludicrous and suggest that I'm something other than a bodily being. I'm not going to, embrace the, ludicrous view that I was never in my mom's womb. Obviously, I just wasn't valuable back then, right? So it's a dualism of morality that when I was a human being, but I wasn't yet a person, it was the real me. I just wasn't valuable. I only became valuable later in life when I could engage in self-awareness, self-consciousness, higher mental activity. And so this has all the same perverse outcomes that the newborn baby and the 1-year-old isn't yet a person, but it also can't explain any of our historic moral practices of human equality, why we treat all human beings equally. If some human beings have greater self-awareness, greater self-consciousness, why don't we have a sliding scale of dignity, et cetera, et cetera. So in the book, we walk readers through, both of those, because you're right. This is when you're in a discussion about abortion with someone really intellectually sophisticated, this is the type of sophistical argument you're going to get.
There's one more argument I want to bring up here, because I think this is going to be perhaps the most dominant popular level argument. And it seems to be a very big deal among the sort of new, loud and proud pro-choice movement of the last few years. And that's the bodily autonomy idea, where they'll sort of bite the bullet and say, yes, okay, the unborn child is a human being in the earliest stages of development. That's just the truth. But the fact is that the woman has a right over her body. And this is sort of the Judith Jarvis Thompson idea with the violinist argument, that even if that is a person, right, I, as a woman, have autonomy over my body and control over my womb. And therefore, it is within my rights to evict the invader. This is the one that I think you'll probably hear a lot from people who don't want to sit there and deny the science or delve into like bad philosophy, like you just described. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, we respond to this at great length in the book. I'm glad you brought it up, because it is becoming, I think, much more common among abortion supporters. Even a year ago, I don't remember hearing much about this kind of forced birth business. That's how they put it now. They say if you're pro-life or anti-abortion, you want to force women to give birth. That's kind of the popular level rhetoric they use, where they're basically kind of hinting at the Judith Jarvis Thompson philosophical argument, which is, okay, there's a human being here, maybe even a human person, but the woman's right not to be pregnant essentially is more important. There are a few levels we could break down, and hopefully Ryan will fill in the gaps if I forget anything. The basic idea is that the human being in pregnancy, the human being in the mother's womb, is there almost in every single case because of a freely chosen act on the part of both the mother and the father. So set aside for a moment cases of rape where the mother didn't consent to participating in the act that brought that child into being. Mothers and fathers are responsible for the fact that that child exists, right? So the proper analogy would be as if the woman had gone over and hooked herself up to the violinist and then said, now I'm going to unplug myself, right? She is attached to the child because of an act that she freely chose. And she is therefore morally responsible. Both parents are morally responsible for that child, but the mother in particular during pregnancy has a unique responsibility that no one else can fulfill to sustain the life of her child. Another point we bring up in the book, which kind of highlights the, I think, dishonesty of the argument, is that if you said, okay, well, if you could just stay pregnant until the point where you could give birth and the child could survive outside the womb and give the child up for adoption, abortion supporters say, no, that's not good enough, right? The safe haven laws they brought up during the Dobbs oral arguments, Justice Barrett asked, why are safe haven laws where a mother can voluntarily surrender her newborn baby, no penalty at all? She doesn't have to say who she is, no legal penalties. And the two pro-abortion attorneys said that's not good enough, right? Because what they want is not to have been a parent at all. They don't want to not be pregnant anymore, which could be achieved after 6 or 9 months even. They don't want to be not a legal parent. They want their child to be dead. They want the right. Abortion is the right to a dead child. And so that's really the logical extension of this argument. It's not about forced birth. It's not about forced pregnancy. It's about forced parenthood. That's what they want to say. They're essentially being forced into parenthood when in fact, pregnancy is the result of an act they chose.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the incongruity between the, Thompson analogy of the violinist being hooked up to you and the vast majority of elective abortions, which take place because of a child that's come into existence due to a chosen act, right? It gets to this very foundational idea. We talked about these things earlier, these foundational ideas that lead to abortion. I think that one of the more foundational ones of all is that sex doesn't make babies, right? That there's a separation between these two things, and that sex is just like a recreational activity or a type of self-expression or something you do that has nothing to with other consenting adults, that has nothing whatsoever to do with childbearing. And so I can imagine the pro-choice way of thinking about this in cases other than rape. So when they say, well, I'm not talking just about rape, I'm talking about all abortions. It's an unjust encroachment on my bodily autonomy by this other being. And the idea that I consented to that in some way by having sex sounds ludicrous to me, because sex doesn't do that. It's not supposed to do that. And to me, that seems like it's like at the beating heart of this whole movement. The idea that we can divorce these things that were put together and that we have that power as human beings. So what do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. And that this is why many people view abortion as like the ultimate contraceptive. They want to render sexuality sterile. And when contraceptives fail, abortion is there as the ultimate backstop. A couple of other things worth saying there is, one is that even if when you engaged in an intentional act of sex, you didn't intend to create a child, we're still responsible for the things that are the consequences of our intentional actions. Right. So it's not as if you have to have intended to create a child that you then have obligations for the child. And we think about this in all sorts of ways. Like if you have an accident, by definition, it wasn't intentional, but you still have responsibilities, right? If you're culpable for the accident, right? If you get hit by someone, you technically had an accident, but you weren't a protagonist there, right? And so in the same way, you can think that there are things that we don't intend, but we're still responsible if we did the voluntary action that caused the problem. There's a lightning strike and a tree on my property falls on my neighbor's house. I'm responsible for that. A variety of ways. So that's part one. But then part two, it doesn't even matter about consenting to the child. If a child has been conceived, you're already a parent, and parents have natural obligations for their children. So part of the problem here is that it's buying into a bad kind of social contractarian theory of morality, right? And so whatever you want to think about, like social contractarian thought for politics, that, there's a hypothetical state of nature, and then we contract into political community, and that's what justifies political authority. The idea that that's what creates all of morality is just, to my mind, utterly a non-starter. That, there are certain virtues that are natural, there are certain rights that are natural, there are certain duties that are natural. So given human nature as it is, there's a natural law. Natural law governs our relationships, and therefore they're going to be goods, virtues, rights, and duties. And you need all four of those concepts if you really want to get a full moral theory up and off the ground and, cognizant. I think the Christian tradition at its best has all four of those concepts, right? We talk about human goods, we talk about human virtues, we talk about both human rights and human duties. I think much of the modern liberal discourse just focuses on rights talk. A great book by Marianne Glendon, the Harvard law professor, titled Rights Talk, criticizing the over excess of rights talk to the exclusion of duty talk, virtue talk, and goods talk. One of the things we try to do in the book is, show how those four concepts really hang together.
I think the most valuable part of the book, and this actually really gets into the second chapter, but the most valuable insight in my mind was this idea that the rights talk, the political formulations, the ideas that we have brought to the abortion debate as a nation, as a people, that have led us to make ridiculous claims like parents have no obligation to their children, or that a child in the womb, where it's supposed to be how we all came into existence, is some kind of invader, right? That these are the result of coming up with political and moral philosophies over here and then trying to impose them on human life over on the other side. Whereas what we should do is build our human life together around our human nature, what we actually are as creatures. And so in the second one, you talk about how abortion harms women and family. And you actually write that abortion injects violence into a sacred and foundational relationship, that relationship being the one between the mother and the child, and actually encourages women to see their own children as antagonists and invaders, and then even distorts the way that men and society as a whole look at women and their bodies. So talk about that for a little bit, because that was really rich for me.
Yeah. So that chapter I think is really important, because the most common argument we hear in favor of abortion is that women need it, right? The idea that women will be better off. This was the Supreme Court's case in Casey. The argument they made in their ruling was women have come to rely on this, right? Women need abortion. There's some way in which women can't participate in the life of a nation unless they have access to abortion. And the kind of particular point you just raised, I think, is the most insidious. Now, in the chapter, we go into kind of how, the abortion procedure physically harms women, both immediately and then after the fact. We talk about how there are long-lasting psychological consequences of abortion for many women that abortion supporters like to just ignore or pretend don't happen. I think that's all really important. But at the theoretical level, I think is where abortion is most harmful to women, even women who never have an abortion, because it says to women, your child might be your enemy, right? If there's a situation in which you think you can't do X, Y, or Z because you're pregnant, or you don't want to be a mother or whatever, just kill it, right? And abortion supporters hold this up as a solution. They say our society is not welcoming to women. It's hard for women to get ahead. Women aren't equal to men. Men mistreat women and get away with it. It is not a solution to then have women turn on their children and to have women victimize their children or treat their children as an object of violence or commit lethal violence against their child in order to save themselves. If women are really in that kind of difficult position, which sometimes we are, committing violence against our own children is not actually a solution to that. And I think our society has deeply failed women by pretending that that's any sort of solution.
And then there's the idea of, just building the normative structures of work or government, or, what it means to what we look at as achievement in life, as living a good and fulfilling and well-lived life around a sort of male-centric template, right? You talk about how abortion treats the male body and the male experience as normative. And I was actually surprised, in the later chapters where you get into how corporate America has enshrined this sort of discrimination against pregnant women, against women who want to prioritize family as a part of their lives, to say, that's not what we want for you. We want you to be in the cubicle on the clock and not ever engaging in that activity outside. And to me, this really gets to the heart of the issue, which is that we have structured things around an artificial idea of human nature instead of what we really are. So, we're in the midst of a transgender debate right now, which has got to be the most bizarre manifestation to date of this sort of expressive individualism that you talked about, Ryan. But one of the earlier manifestations is this idea that the fact that women exclusively bear, gestate, nurse, and, mother children is somehow not normative, that's weird, that's a destructive thing for their life and their ambitions, that they have to actually go to war with not only their kids, like you said, Alexandra, but their own bodies in order to achieve equality. That just, that boggles my mind. But when you begin asking, or when you begin questioning a premise like that, you get much, much deeper than just the question of, can we kill unborn children? You get down to the question of, what is good in life? How should we structure things? What do we expect of people as they grow up? And what do we tell our little girls implicitly and explicitly? And that's why, this sounds unique to me. It sounds like much more than just a book, full of anti-abortion arguments.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. We point out that first wave feminists did not view equality as sameness. They thought there were distinctive maternal and paternal, masculine and feminine gifts, attributes, talents, and that equality meant you would take both of those seriously and you would structure society about the reality about both male embodiment and female embodiment. And then you would have equal legal rights, privileges, protections, et cetera, et cetera. And then second wave feminists said that's not enough, because what they saw was equal rights, legal protections, privileges, et cetera, wasn't getting us where women were making the right choices. You know, from their mind, too many women were choosing to be mothers, blah, blah, blah. I mean, some of them, I don't think we quote it in the abortion book. I quoted this in my transgender book. They wanted to outlaw the choice to be a stay-at-home mother. If I remember correctly, it was Simone de Beauvoir who thought that choice shouldn't be allowed. Who we do quote in the abortion book is a Firestone who makes a Marxist analogy, saying just like the point of the proletariat revolution was for the workers to claim the means of production and take it away from the capitalists, so too in the sexual revolution, we should reclaim the tools of not production, but reproduction, and not have one class of people bearing the babies for the other class of people, right? Women. Yeah. And so, you know, she's actually thinking through about all sorts of forms of, you know, artificial reproductive technologies, cloning, you know, artificial wombs, et cetera, et cetera. And that she says that the ultimate goal is to eliminate the sex distinction, that the ultimate goal wasn't equality, but sameness. And I think that second vision of equality as sameness underlies so many of the mistaken beliefs that we see, you know, with the marriage debate, with the transgender debate, with the abortion debate. The alternative, and this is where we quote our colleague Erica Bacchiacchi, is human reproduction. There's an asymmetry to human reproduction. There's an asymmetry to most mammalian reproduction. How do you respond to it? And one vision is to say that nature itself is bigoted, right? This asymmetrical reality of reproduction is the problem, right? Nature discriminates. And so therefore we have to change human nature. We have to change, in particular, female nature to make it more like male nature, right? Contraception, abortion, et cetera. The other says, you know, look, our embodied reality is true, good, beautiful. And then we should structure our laws, our culture, our economy, our system of higher education to take both the male way and the female way of being human seriously, and to respect both equally, right? And unfortunately, for the past 50 years, we went down that first road rather than going down the second road. And, you know, the overturning of Roe and Casey is going to give us another opportunity to reconsider which road we want to go down.
This is such a great juncture in the discussion, despite the fact that we've only gotten through 2 chapters and we're never going to even come close to getting through the whole book, which I regret. But I think it's a great juncture to look at the overview of the rest of the book, because you've just hit on the head the poisonous idea or conception of humanity that flows out into all of these manifestations and corrupts all of these areas of life. You know, it's this false idea of sameness, this false idea of equality, and the complete disregard for duties and natural features of the human life, like childbearing. So if you can, give me an extremely broad 30,000 foot sketch of the ways in which this conception of being human has corrupted, you know, politics and culture and medicine, especially. These are the areas you go into in the latter chapters. And some of the examples are just like amazing. I couldn't believe this stuff.
Yeah, I'll pull out a few examples. Our chapter on medicine in particular, we look at quite a few things, one of which is the corruption of elite medical organizations, most notably the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and then the American Medical Association, both of which threw their weight behind the legalization of abortion big time ahead of Roe. And I would say were probably kind of the foremost factor in lobbying the court. But what we talk about then after that, not only how these organizations kind of pushed for the legalization of abortion, but what they've become in the wake of legalized abortion, right? These groups are essentially, when it comes to the abortion issue, just partisan cheerleaders for as unlimited abortion laws as possible, right? Just name a pro-life law you could possibly think of, whether it's even something like informed consent before abortion, right? Or telling women about the risks of chemical abortion pills. ACOG and the AMA will come down against it and say that this is somehow anti-abortion, right? That is deeply corruptive for medical organizations to be lobbying against something like informed consent in favor of abortion, which, by the way, is not healthcare, right? This is actually an act that kills a human being. It's never medically necessary. And yet these major medical organizations would do anything. They're staking their reputation on totally unlimited abortion at all costs. So that's one example. In that same chapter, we talk quite a bit about the downstream ways that the logic of abortion has affected medicine. So whether that's things like euthanasia or embryonic stem cell research, the lack of conscience rights, right? So these medical organizations started out with the idea that they should be able to perform legal abortions because doctors have to exercise their medical judgment. Today, if a doctor tries to exercise his medical judgment and say, I don't want to perform abortions, those same groups are going to say, sorry, perform it anyway, right? They don't want doctors to have conscience rights anymore. So major parts of our federal government now don't want doctors to have conscience rights, the ability not to participate in procedures that they don't think are necessary, that they think are morally wrong. So it's very, even though there are all sorts of pro-life doctors all over the place, most OBGYNs will not perform abortions. This kind of the logic of abortion and the dehumanization has infected, I think, the entire medical field.
It's amazing to me that the pro-life movement has been able to overcome the kind of institutional consensus that is backed up abortion, where again and again, ACOG and these other organizations, you kind of document how whenever there was legislation up for debate, whenever there was a case before the court, they all rush in and stamp their scientific medical imprimatur on the pro-choice side and just say, this is, the doctors all say this, and you got to listen to the doctors because they know best. It's amazing to me that pro-lifers were able to even make the progress that they did to the point where this is now, as of this podcast, maybe the picture may be fundamentally changed at the court. What happened? How was that challenged effectively despite this consensus?
Sure. Yeah. I think a big part of it is there have been pro-life doctors there all along. I would point to the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, which is a very effective group. And they point out all the time, what ACOG did around the time of Roe to push for legalized abortion was not something they pulled their members on. This was not like all the OBGYNs across the United States wanted to be able to perform abortions. Very few, and I think it's something like 14% maybe. I think we have the statistic in the book. Percent of OBGYNs even perform abortion. So this is not as though the entire medical field is aggressively pro-abortion. It really is just these kind of the upper levels of these elite medical organizations pushing for this, but kind of there's a grassroots effort of pro-life doctors and pro-lifers in general pushing back on that. And I think it's an effective argument, right, to say that this is not actually healthcare. And I think these groups and Planned Parenthood, which we also debunk extensively in the book, they have a very loud megaphone when it comes to controlling the media, for example, or just their PR is very, very effective. But I don't think it really breaks through kind of past the sort of top level of our politics.
That's interesting. I was just thinking about that yesterday with the transgender issue and how it seems like there's almost like this scientific, medical, institutional consensus around it to where all the big 4-letter organizations have said, yes, we endorse transgender ideology. And it's kind of baffling because it's hard to think of a less scientific claim than that. And yet here it is. And so we've kind of had to fight the corruption of institutions as pro-lifers, and even gives good science an air again against bad philosophy that's taken over.
It's a small selection of self-selected so-called experts, whether reproductive health experts or gender experts, who then make the statements on behalf of the entire professional association. Right? It's not actually all the members of the profession who believe this, but they've been ideologically captured, the professional. And that's why new professional associations are being created.
So I wanted to ask about the political side of this, but it kind of mirrors what happened with the professional associations and science, where the Democratic Party in particular, you document extensively how even very recently there were pro-life Democrats. And now, as you said earlier, Ryan, they're an endangered species. Even one Joe Biden, who you may have heard of, was kind of a holdout in this regard until very, very recently and said, yeah, you know what, I don't really, I'm not really fully on board this because of my Catholicism. I think he did the personally pro-life angle for a while. Maybe he's still doing that, but he has come out, very recently within the year before his presidency and just said, I endorse government-funded abortion for any reason right up until birth. This is just the standard party line now. But in light of this sort of institutional capture, I'm curious for your thoughts on what things look like if the court overturns Roe v. Wade or significantly changes the picture after Dobbs. So not just on the, pro-lifers have to pass new laws angle, but what happens to these consensus that have developed in powerful places when the court no longer agrees with them? What does the process look like of changing that?
They won't have public opinion support. The American people are not where the Democratic Party is. They certainly won't have support in most of the states. Most of the states are red. Many of the states are purple. A few of the states are deep blue. And so, we will see California, New York, Massachusetts, Illinois have some really draconian abortion laws. But we're also going to see some really good pro-life states. We're also going to see some states that are purple on the issue. Most Americans are similar to Europeans. And, it's something like 42 out of the 47 European nations protect unborn babies at the very latest at 15 weeks. I think it's even more at 12 weeks and some more at...
You said 15 weeks. 15 weeks. This is the same line in Mississippi where I think, and in Texas, where pro-choicers were comparing this to like a Margaret Atwood dystopia. No, right. It's like Germany, guys.
That's the Dobbs case. That's the Dobbs case law. It's a 15-week law, which is the case at the Supreme Court right now. And so I think what we're going to see is that like the Democratic Party platform on these questions is not where even the majority of Democrats are, let alone the majority of the American people. And so, moving this question out of the Supreme Court into the Democratic branches and fora of government is going to be salutary. But then I do think, eventually we're going to have to press ahead with 14th Amendment personhood arguments because Lincoln is correct. A house divided cannot stand. We can't be like, 2/3 pro-life states, 1/3 pro-choice states or something like that, where there are going to be problems of, taking minors across state lines, traveling across state lines, mailing abortion pills. At a certain point, we need either federal legislation or a constitutional ruling or a constitutional amendment, a variety of things are going to have to take place both at the state and the local level moving forward.
It's almost like you could expect a fugitive fetus law at some point to happen. This is definitely not over. Alexandra, tell me what the view looks like from there, especially with the medical institutions that you talked about and the sort of capture that's happened there. Does a Planned Parenthood, does a NARAL pro-choice retain the sort of clout they've had in the absence of Roe v. Wade, or what happens there?
Yeah, I kind of have a hard time imagining that they will. And what I think is so interesting, we've witnessed now more than a month, I guess it's been almost 2 months since the leaked draft. And the main response we've seen from the pro-abortion side is violence, right? The number one thing they've done, now, of course, this is not all abortion supporters, but the loudest ones so far have been breaking windows at pregnancy resource centers, throwing Molotov cocktails into pregnancy resource centers. One attempted to kill a Supreme Court justice, right? The loudest supporters are protesting essentially, and some peacefully and some not, because they don't want to lobby. And I find that very interesting, right? They don't actually want to make the case for legalized abortion. They're scared of having to make that case. For 50 years now, abortion on demand has been imposed on the entire country by the Supreme Court. And instead of saying, okay, well, we'll do what the pro-life movement has done for 50 years and just go back to basics and lobby in every state legislature, lobby at the federal level for the abortion policy we want, they try to intimidate the Supreme Court. And they try to attack the people who are helping women in need, right? They don't have an argument to make. I think they're frightened of making the argument actually in favor of abortion. And that's why you get this sort of response. Now, I can't predict what that's going to look like in a post-Roe America necessarily, but I don't think they have any good arguments, right? That's why our entire book basically is debunking all the crazy things they say to try and defend abortion, because there's no good way to say, yes, I think it should be acceptable and legal to kill innocent human beings so that people can get ahead, right? There's not a nice way to say that. And no one supports that. That's why all they do is lie. And so I'll be interested to see what happens to Planned Parenthood. They'll still be performing abortions, but I think they're going to give it a couple of decades. I don't think they'll be doing very well.
Well, we're at the end of our time here. We've kind of crested the hill and we're looking out into the future. My listeners will no doubt be hearing this in the immediate aftermath and the kind of Twitter storms and whatever else happens, protest after the decision officially comes down. I want to just, as we close here, look ahead and ask ourselves what a successful pro-life movement looks like in the future, 10, 20, 30, another 50 years down the road in this country. If this really is the juncture that many people are praying and hoping it is, what does success look like now that we've passed this milestone? Is it a human life amendment? Is it, you tell me, what do you think it looks like?
Every child is protected in law. And, how we get there is going to be a question for, charitable and prudential discussion. So it could be a human life amendment. It could be a constitutional ruling under the 14th Amendment. It could be federal legislation. It could be, all 50 states, one by one, enact pro-life laws. I mean, a variety of ways of getting there. And we're going to have to see, which one is most doable, most feasible, most accomplishable, given political realities on the ground. So that's part one, is that every life needs to be protected. And then part two, every mother needs to have the resources she needs to bring that child into life, and then either raise the child in the context of, ideally a family with the father involved, the mother and the father committed to each other, committed to the child, or finding a family that can do that. I think adoption services are going to have to increase as more women are able to bring their child into the world, but are unable to give the child the gift of a upbringing. They can still give the child the gift of life and then work to find a family who can give the child the gift of an upbringing. So I think we're going to have to see, laws protecting unborn children all throughout the country, public policy and cultural supports for mothers to be able to choose life for their children. And then again, public policy and cultural supports to have, adoption and other provisions in place to care for children who cannot be cared for by their biological parents.
No, I think Ryan put it very well. I think I would just emphasize the incrementalism of it. I think it's important to care about what's politically feasible, right? As much as we all want to live in an America where all of us believe in the protection of human life from the moment of conception, we're not going to be there the day after Roe is overturned. And I think we have to be charitable and prudent in how we get there.
Excellent. Well, my guests today have been Ryan Anderson and Alexandra DeSanctis, authors of the new book, Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. This is actually our July premium, which means that for a gift of any amount to the Colson Center, we're going to send you a copy of this great new book. It's truly powerful and I think concise as a summary of not only this issue, but this moment. And I really can't recommend it enough. So thank you, Ryan and Alexandra, for writing the book and for joining me today on Upstream. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.